From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power. This is where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Yvonne Mann from Hong Kong on the coronavirus and David Goodman from London on Mark Carney's finale as Bank of England governor. So, Yvonne, thank you once again for your reporting from Hong Kong. Really appreciate it. Bring us up to date on exactly where we are right now over in China with the coronavirus.
Well, the WHO at this hour, David, meeting in this emergency committee on whether to declare this coronavirus as an international health emergency. What's different this time from a week ago when they refrained from declaring this an international emergency is this concern now of transmission without symptoms, where you see more evidence now that this disease could be transmitted to people before they show any signs of illness. And we certainly learned that from one case with a 10-year-old boy that was diagnosed with the coronavirus and displayed no symptoms. So this just makes controlling the disease that much more difficult as the numbers continue to ramp up. More than 8,000 cases now, and the death toll rising to 170, all of which have occurred in China. We've learned that countries like India and the Philippines reporting their first cases now, and a cruise ship in Italy tonight under lockdown with 7,000 people on board after one passenger displayed some symptoms of the virus. So the situation certainly evolving quite quickly.
So obviously in Wuhan, things are pretty much shut down. Give us a sense of the rest of China, for example, in Hong Kong. Are people going to the office? Is business going forward at all?
Well, we've seen things certainly slow down. I was just around the central business district here today, where you're seeing a lot less people on the streets. A lot of companies, the banks especially, have told their employees that if you don't need to be in the office, do work from home. And we certainly have heard that from many people from the financial world. So things have certainly slowed down. And when it comes to the Lunar New Year holiday, China as well has been making some moves and extending that holiday for 3 days. So financial markets are going to remain closed until Monday. We've also heard from cities like Shanghai, some other regional cities that are telling their employees don't come back to work probably until mid-February to try to control this disease from spreading further.
Yvonne, I don't expect you to speak for 1.1 billion people, but do we have any sense of the extent to which the people in China have confidence in the authorities, understanding it's a really difficult situation, it's really hard to get their arms around? Do they have confidence the Chinese authorities are doing what needs to be done?
Well, they've done some unprecedented measures, as we talked about with this Wuhan lockdown, but there has been a lot of, speculation out there that perhaps the numbers are bigger than what's been reported right now. Of course, we cannot confirm that, but you see social media with it's just going rampant here on videos of people panicking, the panic buying when it comes to face masks, which is facing a shortage here in Hong Kong as well. So the fact that the WHO is having this meeting right now could send quite a serious message if they declare this public health emergency of international concern. That would send a strong message of just how serious this is and whether international coordination is needed when it comes to personnel, funds, and stopping this disease.
Okay, Yvonne, thank you once again. Really appreciate your reporting from Hong Kong. Our thoughts are with you and all our Bloomberg colleagues over in China. And now we're going to turn to the Bank of England and David Goodman over in London. So Mark Carney had his last appearance as the governor of the Bank of England and basically said, we're not doing anything, David.
Yeah, exactly. The MPC voted to keep rates on hold at 0.75%. It was quite a clear-cut vote. It was 7-2 in the end, and that was kind of against market expectations. People were looking for either more dissent or an outright cut in interest rates. The market was pricing around about a 50% chance beforehand. The decision was really seen as kind of finely balanced, and what was delivered was a hold that really had no change in terms of the kind of headline vote than last month. But there was some more kind of dovish commentary beneath that. We had a cut to the growth forecast, inflation forecasts that isn't going to reach the BOE's goal until kind of well into next year, right at the end, and that's based on the market path that does contain a rate cut. So maybe a bit more mixed picture than the 7-2 vote suggested, but if you look at the market reaction, they're obviously set up for a more a more dovish surprise. So the pound's jumped up today, is at 0.6%, and that's the highest level this week.
Right. So, David, as you say, going into this, it was sort of a coin flip as far as people were saying that we don't know which way it's going to go. Is this also sort of a war of backward-looking numbers and forward-looking numbers? Because some of the backing-looking numbers, the hard numbers, as it were not very encouraging, but they were sort of before the election. There are some other numbers that I guess Mark Carney pointed to that said are more encouraging.
Yes, exactly. There's this real kind of split from numbers that, as you say, came before the election. In January, we saw some retail sales numbers. The inflation numbers came in fairly weak. Obviously, growth in November wasn't great and actually contracted, whereas all these kind of private surveys we've had since the election have showed this kind of real pickup in confidence. And I think because of that pickup, officials have said we're kind of prepared to wait and see how this plays out. But at the same time, if those pickup in sentiment doesn't really translate into the hard data, then we could be talking about a rate cut again next time the BOE meet.
Okay, thank you so much, David. Really appreciate the reporting from London. That's David Goodman, our colleague over there. And now it's time we get a check on the markets and how they may be reacting to some of today's top stories. For that, we turn to Abigail Doolittle. So it doesn't look too good.
Yeah, it's a bit of a risk-off feeling for sure today. Yesterday it was as well, but under the surface. So it's continuing into today, really blooming to some degree. And we have some strong earnings reports, but really being overshadowed by the macro concerns about that coronavirus that you were just talking about with Yvonne Mann. Here in the U.S., we have the S&P 500 right now down for a second day in a row. That's the second two-day decline that we've had in quite some time, Friday into Monday, right now on pace for its worst week since August. And if you take a look at a couple of those Asian indexes, which have reopened from that Lunar New Year, we have the Taiwan Stock Exchange down nearly 6%, its worst day since October of 2018. The Hang Seng down in a big way for a second day in a row. The worst two-day stretch for the Hang Seng going all the way back to February of 2018, so basically in 2 years. So concerns around this coronavirus and what the impact on the global economy will be really hanging over the markets.
And I suppose that's one of the biggest questions, whether you're a CEO or you're a government official. It's not just that it's happening, but we don't know. There's so much uncertainty. Is that reflected in volatility at this point?
We don't actually have all that much in volatility.
That's
volatility is up today. Technically, there's reason to think that the VIX could surge. So that uncertainty that you're talking about may be reflected in the future through the VIX and other volatility indexes. But that uncertainty is really the big deal. What will be the fallout? And it's also going to depend on what we learn about this coronavirus as time goes on. Relatively long incubation period. So Yvonne Mann was talking about the possibility that there's a much bigger contagion out there than we're aware of. If that's confirmed, that could really create a bigger
impact. And the thing
impact.
that authorities seem to be focused on, that asymptomatic transmission.
Yes,
whether you transmit it even if you don't have any symptoms, it seems to be really worrying people.
That seems to be worrying people quite a bit. We haven't heard of any reports here in New York, obviously, yet. But should that occur, if there's more of something here in the U.S., that could cause the declines that we're seeing for stocks right now really grow even more. Hopefully that doesn't happen.
We should hope for that. Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. And now, of course, it's a time to turn to Mark Crumpton because he's here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, time is running out for Senate Democrats in the impeachment trial of President Trump. They're trying to persuade at least 4 Republicans to agree to call witnesses. A showdown vote is likely tomorrow. Democrats want to question former National Security Advisor John Bolton. His new book has revelations about President Trump and Ukraine. More fallout from the deadly coronavirus. Russia is moving to close its 2,600-mile border with China. Meanwhile, the Chinese now say that 170 people have died, and the number of cases on the mainland has risen to more than 8,000. The World Health Organization has called a meeting of its emergency committee for today. The WHO may issue a global alarm. The group's looking at evidence the disease can be transmitted before a person shows any signs of illness. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the United States and Britain will keep and enhance their special relationship once the UK leaves the European Union this week. He also says American unhappiness with the British decision to allow the Chinese tech company Huawei to play a role in the country's high-speed wireless network will not affect broader ties. Secretary Pompeo is in London, where he met with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The United States is finding ways to provide humanitarian aid to Iran. The Treasury Department says it has opened a banking channel through Switzerland nearly 2 years after President Trump withdrew from an international nuclear agreement with Iran and reinstated tough economic sanctions. Officials say cancer and organ transplant patients in Iran were the first to benefit from the new channel. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up tomorrow on Balance of Power, we're going to have a special interview with Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve Board. He is Rich Clarida. He's going to be here live to talk about monetary policy and how an independent Fed takes into account the social and political ramifications of what it decides. That's coming up tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Time is running out for Senate Democrats in the impeachment trial, and they're trying to persuade at least 4 Republicans to agree to call witnesses. Let's bring in now Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent from Washington, Kevin Cirilli. So, Kevin, it looks like Mitch McConnell is going to pull it out.
Yeah, it does. And in fact, all morning I was talking with sources just about in terms of the math and the logistics as it relates to whether or not they're going to get these votes to have witnesses. And right now, the math simply isn't there. Senator Cory Gardner, a Republican up for re-election, tough re-election battle, he's suggested that he doesn't feel necessarily that there would need to be witnesses called to this trial. So the trajectory of this trial has not significantly changed, even following that John Bolton manuscript report in the New York Times. So the working timetable, should there not be witnesses, David, is that this impeachment trial could be wrapped up by late Friday evening or even Saturday morning. Now, obviously that could still change, but the calculation behind the scenes, according to my reporting, that folks are making here is that should John Bolton be forced to testify, Hunter Biden would no doubt be called into question as well.
I also wonder, Kevin, a lot of people are asking, what's the point in all this? Did anything really change? Because we sort of knew the Senate was going to vote to quit. But was there a point, potentially a political point, in that essentially the Democrats have forced the Republicans to come out and say what Alan Dershowitz has been saying, which is like, if the president did all of it, there's nothing wrong with it.
Exactly. And look, that has been the case that Republicans have been making for quite some time, which is that on the issue of ambassadors, the president, the commander-in-chief, should be able to decide who is his ambassador and not. On the issue of conducting foreign policy, that is up to the commander-in-chief. Now, Democrats take great issue with that assessment that I just gave. Democrats would push for transparency. They would push as well as for not freezing military assets, and they feel that that is impeachable. But in terms of those 4 senators and whether or not they can get them, it just hasn't been enough as of now. And again, it's a fluid situation. It hasn't been enough to put cracks in Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's wall.
Okay, thank you so much to Kevin Cirilli from that
Thank you.
reporting from Washington. And now we want to bring in Bloomberg political contributor Rick Davis. He, of course, ran John McCain's presidential campaign. He also is now with the firm of,
Stone Court Capital.
Stone Court. It's Harlan Fistone, right, is the name? It's Stone Court Capital.
Exactly.
Great,
exactly.
Thanks. Great to have you here. So let's pick up with where we're right now. We could have a world in which we have a double box between the impeachment and the Iowa caucuses, something we've never seen before. So if there's a war on for the television set, which one wins out? Which influences which?
Well, it depends on the time of day, right? The good news is by the time we're reporting the caucus results on Monday night, the impeachment hearings will have ended in the Senate. So we'll have unbridled attention of the American public, from Bloomberg in Iowa, telling them who's going to win the Iowa caucus. But it is a unique thing. David, we've been around a long time. We've never seen anything like this. President of the United States, who's up for re-election in 10 months, the election will be held, is, basically in the box in the Senate, fighting for his life and his presidency, while Democrats are fighting to be the challenger to Donald Trump, some of which are stuck in the Senate at the same time.
Well, how much is that hurting those senators who are stuck in the Senate at this point? Is that hurting?
It has to hurt them. Democrats will make the argument that, hey, they're doing their job, they're doing their duty, and that's a good thing. Sure, but Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren especially have been working for at least 2 years. Bernie for 4 to win the Iowa caucus. He's been there 1,000 times, and this is when the rubber hits the road. And these candidates are used to going door to door at this point. and they're stuck in the United States Senate. It has to hurt.
So you've done these campaigns out there. There's a slew of Iowa caucus goers who say they're uncommitted at this point. I mean, not half, but something approaching half of them say we haven't decided yet. What's going to change their mind at the last minute?
You know, a lot of it is what their neighbors are talking about. A lot of it is their second choices, right? A lot of these caucus goers, in addition to the ones that are undecided at this point, which are a lot, there are a lot who are not going to get their first choice. And so they're starting to think through, gee, if, Mayor Pete doesn't win, who am I going to be for on the second and third ballot in my caucus? And so this is a really trying time for them. And that's why it's so important that these candidates are there to be in their face and say, hey, I need you, I want you, I respect your vote. Give it to me.
So we're focused on Iowa right now, and as you say, I'm delighted we're going to have you out there with us, which will be a real treat. But there is a primary coming up just a few days after that in New Hampshire. Are we overlooking New Hampshire, or is this the way it happens every time?
It happens every time. Sometimes New Hampshire is even closer to Iowa, and it gets even less attention because it doesn't have the week in between. And look, this is the price you pay for being the first in the nation primary, right? Is you've got to pay second fiddle to Iowa. And this is an especially interesting year for Iowa because it's such a close race with so many candidates. Yeah. Any one of 4 or 5 could win. So obviously attention is going to be riveted onto Iowa for at least the remaining 72 hours.
Which might mean, you correct me here, but it might mean that somebody like a Bernie Sanders, who typically gets pluralities, not majorities, might do well because a plurality does all right for you when you've got 4 or 5 candidates who are in the race. Absolutely.
I mean, really, whoever wins this Democratic nomination isn't going to win it with a majority of the vote. I mean, they're going to win it with 35, 38%. You can win a lot of primaries and a lot of delegates that way. That's how John McCain won the 2008 primary in the Republican Party. He didn't see 50% in any caucus or primary until well into the process. So we're going to find a candidate. There's no question about it. Democrats are going to nominate somebody, and it's going to be somebody who has less than a majority of the support of the Democratic Party.
And the question is, how electable do they have to be?
That's the big pivot.
Right. Can they beat President Donald Trump?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you so much to Bloomberg contributor Rick Davis. Rick is going to be joining us, as we've said, out in Iowa for live coverage of the caucus results. That starts at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday. Live from New York, this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for antitrust angst. And we're going to start off with T-Mobile and Sprint. They have been trying to steer their merger through a regulatory maze, if not minefield, for nearly 2 years now. And we could be coming to a conclusion after a trial was held this month to hear complaints from state attorneys general to stop the merger. Joining us now is Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst for antitrust litigation, Jennifer Rhee, and Bilal Sayed. He is the director of the Office for Policy Planning at the FTC. So welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
So let's start with a quick rundown on T-Mobile Sprint, because the state attorneys general came up and said, we don't like that deal so much. Is it the ARBs would suggest maybe it's not going to get done?
You know, and I have to agree with that at this point. Yeah, no, I do. I attended most of that trial. It closed up with the closing arguments on January 15th. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think the states really did a good job in making their case. Now, I will say it's close. I mean, there's some good arguments also made by the companies to support in defense of their deal. But this is a really difficult case for the companies to defend against because it's a horizontal merger in a concentrated market and essentially a 4-to-3 with markets that will exceed the HHIs, the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, showing that it's likely to be anti-competitive.
So much for industrial policy. Forget that 5G investment. We're not that concerned about it. So let's talk about tech here, actually, if we could. Where are we with those tech investigations that seem to be the FTC and the antitrust division were sort of wrestling about who's doing what?
So, you know, we're both agencies, plus the states, are looking at different parts of the industry. I can't tell you where they are, but they're serious investigations. And at least in terms of the FTC, you know, the chairman has brought some big cases when he was bureau director. And I think, you know, he's interested, if there's a case to be made, for heavily scrutinizing what's going on in that industry.
One thing that you were involved in, as I understand it, and you can't talk about, is vertical merger guidelines. Where are we in vertical mergers?
So that we've prepared a draft updating a 35-year-old document that the Department of Justice had released. We've got a draft out for public comment. Public comment period will close in February at some point. And then we're going to work real hard to get the guidance out as final. to make sure firms, lawyers, the antitrust community, the business community have a clear understanding of how we're thinking about vertical mergers. The guidance that was out there was 35 years old. And if you weren't paying attention to every case that we brought each agency brought over the last 20 years, you might think we were way behind the times. So, this is law enforcement. We ought to be transparent. We ought to be clear about what we're doing.
That sounds like a good proposition. So, Jennifer, I must say I've sort of lost track of this, but there was a time when I thought the Chicago school was ascendant, and the Chicago school said, don't spend that much time worrying about vertical mergers. Now, there's some people saying, no, Chicago school is not the way to go. Where are we right now? In general, there's not as much scrutiny for vertical mergers, is there?
There generally isn't as much scrutiny, although I think it's a fallacy that they just fly through.
Yeah.
There has been scrutiny of vertical mergers, even in the Chicago school. Vertical mergers in the past have been abandoned due to challenges, or they've needed a remedy in order to get closed. So I think that there has been scrutiny, but there is less, David, because vertical integration tends to come with more pro-competitive efficiencies. They can be good for consumers, much more so than a merger of two competitors, which is just concentrating a market. And because of that, vertical mergers do tend to go through more than horizontal mergers. I think that these guidelines are actually really good reflection of the way the agencies have been scrutinizing vertical mergers for some time now, and I think provide a really flexible approach. I think it's a really good piece of work product by Bilal and by his colleagues in the Department of Justice.
So, Bilal, one of the things that caught my eye was a report that there's an investigation going on now about possible transmission of information among the index funds as they really take big positions in these companies, and they could be communicating things about potential mergers and things. Now, that's an investigation. You can't comment on that. But what would be the theory?
Well, I think there are two theories. There are two potential theories that we need to pay attention to. One is that firms communicate, and that's a violation of the Sherman Act, Section 1, straight up, easy to understand. Now, I'm not suggesting it's happening, but there's been such a change over the last 40 years.
Just to explain to me, if the idea is two companies might be thinking about merging, they would both communicate with the index fund, and therefore there'd be some communication, not directly between the companies, but through an index fund.
Right. The concern is either directly or indirectly. They would be a channel for anti-competitive conduct, discussions about anti-competitive conduct. Now, I'm not saying any of that's occurring.
No, I understand that.
But the industry has changed. The investment community has changed over the last 40 years, and we want to start paying attention to it. And in addition, it's entirely possible, or at least theoretical, that the companies who have common investors may temper their competition because of concerns about what the institutional investors or any investors may say. So we just want to start paying attention to it. It's something that wasn't thought about 40 years ago, and we ought to think about it now.
Yeah, we weren't where we were today on passive investing 40 years ago, right?
Exactly.
It's a change in the whole
changed.
investment climate. Okay, many thanks now to Bloomberg's Jennifer Rhee and Federal Trade Commission's Bilal Sayed. Great to have you here. And a programming note, on Tuesday night, we're going to have coverage of President Trump's State of the Union address and the Democratic response. That all starts at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston. From Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, a Carnival cruise ship with 7,000 people on board is being blocked from leaving an Italian port. Officials say a passenger from Macau had come down with symptoms that are raising concerns about a possible case of coronavirus. But officials say preliminary tests indicate the virus is not present. Cruise ships where passengers are in close contact over extended periods of time are particularly susceptible to outbreaks and spreads of viruses. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi isn't saying whether the House would subpoena additional witnesses, such as former National Security Advisor John Bolton, if the Senate doesn't do so in its impeachment trial. She also said today she doesn't think President Trump knows right from wrong. At a news conference today, the Speaker said the House brought a strong impeachment case, and she's hopeful the Senate will do, in her words, the right thing. Strong winds gusting across Southern California have toppled several panels of a new barrier being installed along the U.S.-Mexico border. The U.S. Border Patrol says the panels fell into Mexican territory about 100 miles east of San Diego. Officials say the 30-foot tall panels had just been anchored in concrete that had not yet set when the gusts hit. The worst locust outbreak East Africa has seen in 70 years is growing. Officials say tens of millions of dollars are needed to help control it. The United Nations says just $15 million has been earmarked, far short of the $76 million needed. The locusts, moving in swarms of hundreds of millions, have destroyed crops in a region already facing food shortages. Experts say if left unchecked, the number of locusts could grow by 500 times current levels. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. It's time now for the stock of the hour. It's Archer Daniels Midland. It is rallying more than 4% and heading for its best day since last April. This after the agricultural commodity trader beat estimates in the fourth quarter. Kaylee Lyons is here with more. So Archer Daniels Midland doing all right.
Yeah, I mean, this was a big beat. Earnings per share came in at $1.42. That was more than double what analysts were estimating. But a big chunk of that is the fact that they're benefiting from this one-time biodiesel fuel tax credit that benefited them to the tune of about $270 million. But even when you take that aside, earnings still would have beat. And that's really due largely to the nutrition business. They made a couple big acquisitions in that business, including Neovia, which is an animal health business they bought for $1.8 billion. And nutrition was up 64% this quarter. So that's helping offset the fact that that traditional crop buying and selling business is still pretty weak. You have U.S. farmers not selling as many goods, in part because of a delayed harvest, but also because exports are pretty low. Now, the bright side of that is that ADM is saying that they think 2020 is going to look a little bit better, in part because of that phase one deal between the U.S. and China. Executives commenting on the conference call said they do think China is going to make those agricultural buys. It's about $32 billion that was promised in the deal, and they think that's going to improve market conditions. And a big part of that, too, is ethanol, because ADM currently is trying to offload some of its ethanol dry mills business, because that's a business that's seeing a lot of margin pressure. You had all this overproduction, thinking there was going to be so much demand from China, which didn't really play out because of the trade war, but that picture could change as we move forward in the year.
So they're looking forward to selling a lot more to China.
Yes.
China has some other issues they're dealing with right now, coronavirus. Every CEO we talk to, we ask, what's China doing to your business? Most of them say, we're not sure yet.
Yeah.
Is Archer Daniels Midland, do they have any sense of what that might mean for them in 2020, good or bad?
I mean, broadly, they said it's really too early to tell. They say at this point, they don't expect the impact to be significant, but it's not to say that they don't have exposure, because they have a stake in Wilmer International, which has about 350 locations in China, including 9 plants that are in areas that are currently shut down. So the exposure definitely is there. Again, too soon to make the call, but you also have to think we're talking about commodities largely here, and should there be any economic growth implications that ripple through to the broader global economy, that could weigh on their business.
Well, you raise such an important point, because commodities overall, hard and soft, have been going down. I mean, really, they've been really almost in a recession here. Are other agricultural companies showing results like Archer Daniels Midland? Are they coming up with the tide?
Well, Archer Daniels Midland is actually outperforming the likes of a Bunge, which is, you know, we have these ABCD of agricultural commodity traders, and Archer Daniels Midland has been outperforming, in part because they're making these strategic acquisitions, kind of shifting away from just biofuels more toward this nutrition area, and they seem to be reaping the benefits of that.
Reaping, so to speak. Yeah, that's a good pun, though. That's really good.
It was not on purpose.
Thank you so much to Kayla Lyons for that report on ADM. In the meantime, let's stay with the breadbasket of America, sort of. Part of the Bloomberg team is already on the ground out in Iowa. And for a report on what's happening right now, we go to Tyler Pager in Des Moines. So you're a reporter on the ground, Tyler. What are you learning?
Yeah, so just with 4 days until the Iowa caucuses and this Democratic nominating process really kicks off, the race is really still fluid. We see Bernie Sanders has taken a jump and kind of consolidated the left wing of the party and expanded this base to take the lead. But really, there's 3 other people, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, and Elizabeth Warren, that all have a serious shot at winning the caucuses here on Monday night.
So do you have any sense about what a sitting senator like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, for that matter, or Amy Klobuchar, what they're doing from the Senate as they sit in impeachment, as opposed to what former Vice President Biden or Pete Buttigieg, former mayor, are doing on the ground?
Yeah, so Biden and Buttigieg are barnstorming across the state, holding events throughout, trying to connect with voters and sell their final pitch about really electability here, while as Sanders, Klobuchar, and Elizabeth Warren have deployed surrogates out here in Iowa, trying to sell their message while they're obviously serving on jury duty there in the Senate. But they've also called in. Amy Klobuchar flew in after the trial ended and did a quick event in Council Bluffs on the western part of the state. And they're all trying to maximize the amount of time. But again, they are at a disadvantage, whereas Pete Buttigieg can hold 5 town halls a day and interact face-to-face with voters. The senators don't have that opportunity. I think they're hoping to be out here this weekend and try to make up for lost time, but they're definitely at a disadvantage with the Senate trial still going on.
Tyler, the polls all indicate there's a fair number of undecideds left among the caucus goers. Do you have any sense about what they're really concerned about, what they're interested in, and do they care about the impeachment at all out there?
Impeachment is not a topic that you really hear come up from voters, and the candidates are not talking about it too much either. Voters here, Democratic voters, like across the country, their biggest issue is who can defeat Donald Trump. And so you're seeing a lot of these top candidates in their final messages pitching themselves as why they're best able to do that. And whether that's Joe Biden citing polls, or Bernie Sanders saying the Democrats need historic turnout to defeat Trump, they're all kind of making this final pitch around electability and defeating Donald Trump. And that's what you're hearing out here on the trail. And from the undecided voters as well, is that they just aren't sure yet, even though they've had so many months about who that best candidate is. So we'll see a lot of people walking into those caucus sites and precincts making their decisions on caucus night.
Okay, Tyler, thank you so much for reporting from Iowa. I look forward to seeing you this weekend, because we're going to have live coverage out there in Iowa of those caucus results. That starts at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday. Coming up tomorrow on Balance of Power, we're going to have a special interview with the Vice Chair of the Federal Reserve Board. He is Rich Clarida. He's going to be live to talk with us about monetary policy and how an independent Fed takes into account the social and political ramifications of what it decides. That's tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Goldman Sachs' new leadership has given investors an unprecedented look under the hood. The investment bank has a plan that could leave it looking more like an everyday bank. Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon spoke yesterday to Bloomberg's Sonali Basak at the Goldman Sachs 2020 Investor Day here in New York.
You know, the feedback's quite positive. I think people appreciate the fact that we did it. I think people really appreciate the transparency. And they also appreciate the fact that we've laid out a clear path forward for our business, strengthening our existing businesses, making some investments in some new businesses. And so the feedback so far has been very constructive.
Well, those new businesses, you are entering transaction banking, wealth management, and a lot of banks are already in that space. How does Goldman differentiate itself? What's the investor thesis for Goldman Sachs?
Well, we've been in the wealth management business, for example, for a long time. We've just dealt with the ultra high net worth slice of the wealth management business. And we now see an opportunity through our United Capital acquisition and our ACO platform to expand that to high net worth individuals. And so that's a really good opportunity for us. One of the things we laid out today in our Investor Day is we look for opportunities that are adjacent or synergistic with strengths that we have in our core business. And so that's an example of that. But I think when you look at Goldman Sachs and you ask what the broad thesis is, what we tried to lay out today is we see opportunities to strengthen our existing businesses, add some new businesses, diversify our revenue mix so it's a little bit more durable, and run the firm more efficiently. And if we do that, we will drive the returns higher, and hopefully shareholders will be rewarded.
You mentioned a lot of this is organic growth, but you didn't rule out a merger or an acquisition. Do you think the Federal Reserve will give you the leeway you need to buy a bank?
Well, I never said that we would buy a bank, so it's interesting that you're asking that question. We look at
possible?
We look for opportunities to grow our business organically, and then occasionally there are opportunities to do something inorganically that allows you to accelerate part of your plan. United Capital was a great example of that. We wanted to move more quickly into the high net worth wealth management business, and United Capital gave us more of a platform to accelerate that expansion. So that's a great example of finding something inorganically that can accelerate part of your strategic plan. When we look at the landscape and think about things that we want to do, that's mostly what we're focused on. But we're not out there looking to buy a big bank. We want to be Goldman Sachs. We want to do what we can do, but we're providing banking services on our platform, and that's been one of the big evolutions for us.
So speaking of things that are changing at Goldman Sachs, one interesting thing I had picked up today was that pay for performance would be changing slightly. What's one tangible way that your bankers will be evaluated differently as you're thinking about how they're compensated moving forward?
Well, I want to be clear. Pay for performance is not changing at all. This has always been a pay for performance culture. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure the incentives align to really driving the overall performance of the firm forward for the benefit of shareholders. How do we drive returns higher as an organization so that we believe will create more long-term shareholder value? And to that, we're starting to put a broader set of metrics in place to reward senior people based on behaviors in addition to driving revenue.
So what are some of those examples?
Those examples can include really embracing and enhancing our One Goldman Sachs culture of really making sure we're delivering for clients across the organization and breaking down barriers and trying to really make sure the client experience for all our clients is the best that it can possibly be. And so there are metrics to look and reward people who are really enhancing that as opposed to hindering it. We also have a whole variety of cultural metrics that we think are very important to make this place as attractive a talent center as it's been. And so people have to participate in that and really help make sure that we hire, we retain, we keep the best talent inside Goldman Sachs. So there are a variety of things that we can track and we can metric, and we think they're important.
That was Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon speaking to Bloomberg's Shonali Baska. We have a red headline right now crossing the Bloomberg. The CDC now has confirmed the first case of person-to-person transmission of the coronavirus in the United States. It said Thursday, that's today, that it's confirmed the first case. There are now 6 confirmed cases of coronavirus in the United States, 2 of which are in Illinois. So once again, the CDC is saying they have the first confirmed case of a person transmitting the coronavirus to another person inside the United States. We will keep you up to date on that story as it develops. And now a programming note. On Tuesday night, we're going to have the coverage of the President Trump's State of the Union address and the Democratic response. That all starts at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I want to turn to that breaking news right now. The CDC has just reported the first confirmed case of one person transmitting the coronavirus to another person inside the United States. The report we have on the Bloomberg actually is this is the spouse of someone who had traveled to Wuhan, came back with the coronavirus, and now has transmitted it to their spouse. We're now joined by Max Neeson, who covers healthcare and Bloomberg Opinion. Great to have you here, Max. So tell us the significance of this new development.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously it's a scary headline to see, but the fact that this is 2 people that were in close contact, the sort of situation where you might, sort of assume would be the most likely kind of transmission to happen, that's pretty reassuring. It's not like we're seeing, cases pop out of nowhere. This is something I imagine the CDC was already watching. They're looking at people who have traveled to China, those close to them. So I wouldn't say this should dramatically alter anyone's opinion of how serious this is.
I mean, for those who live in the United States, we're particularly focused on what happens in the United States. But did we basically understand people could transmit it to other people in China, for example? Is that a development?
We already understood that's what's happening.
See.
Yeah, so this can be transmitted via droplets. The question is how easily that happens. That's still open, whether it can happen when people aren't showing symptoms. But we are getting the sense that is something that happens with some frequency. The fact that this is not so severe might be a potential avenue for further transmission. So on one hand, you're sort of reassured by the fact that the death rate isn't that high, but the fact that it isn't so serious means that it could go pretty far without people actually noticing too much, which is a little scary.
This is an important development, particularly important for the people directly involved, goodness knows, but maybe not as important as you suggested some other possibilities. With the WHO reconsidering now, as I understand, whether this is a global health emergency, not just in China. How important is the question of asymptomatic transmission? Because we've heard various things about that. The Chinese at one point said it did happen. We said we weren't sure that had been confirmed.
So that is tremendously important because it'll read through to whether you have these sort of isolated transmissions within other countries, like we just saw here, where it's people that have traveled, a spouse, someone really close to them, or if there are people, walking around shedding virus right now that don't know that they have it, and potentially leading to, a greater spread in countries outside of China. So far, it's been pretty confined in just about every country outside of China, and I think that's why you have the WHO only now trying to make that determination once again, whether it's a global emergency or, again, just something that's of most concern in China.
Max, what as a practical matter turns on whether the WHO declares that or not? I mean, are there funds that get released? Are there actions taken by governments? Or what happens if they decide that?
So the biggest shift, the biggest consequence is that the WHO will get more power to sort of collectively direct government responses, to have a more standardized response, to demand, data in a certain format. At the end of the day, if they do end up declaring that, I would caution people to not take that as a sign to panic or something. It's just acknowledging that there's been enough of a spread, there's been person-to-person transmission in enough countries that it's worth coordinating a global response more directly by this organization that does have a lot of experience with these sort of global epidemics before.
Do we have a sense, do you have a sense, whether we are getting the information out of China that we wanted? When it first happened, people gave them a lot of credit for disclosing the basic formation of the DNA, disclosed that. But then there were reports after that that we're not getting as much information on mutation and some of the other issues. Do you have a sense whether they're really opening it up so that the scientists can know what's going on?
So you do hear sort of both sides. You saw the WHO press conference the other day. They sort of lavished praise on China for how rapidly they sequence the virus, how rapidly they're shared information and the information they're sharing on a daily basis. On the other hand, you have reports that early on in the process, China perhaps hoped that it could sort of limit the sort of information that got out, maybe try to take care of this early without creating sort of the global media firestorm that we're seeing now. It does seem to be a mixed bag, but the first kind of authority I trust is probably the WHO, and they seem to be indicating that, especially relative to the SARS outbreak, other outbreaks in the past, the level of transparency and information does seem to be pretty good from China.
On the United States side, we had President Trump yesterday sort of designating a task force, as it were, led by the HHS Secretary, Alex Azar. What can they do? Alex Azar thus far has said, we think it's a big problem in China. It's not an immediate risk to U.S. citizens.
And I would think that's a pretty accurate assessment based on what we know now. But they can, up screening at different airports. We already saw that happen recently. And then further try to direct the medical response, the effort to come up with a potential vaccine. Already some work on that, obviously very early. And we're unlikely to see human tests or let alone something at production scale for a long time to come. But, to try and move that along as rapidly as possible in the case that this does sort of go on for months and spread further in the United States and elsewhere.
Okay, Max, many thanks for stepping in. That's Bloomberg Opinion's Max Neeson, and we'll keep you up to date on the coronavirus as it develops. In the meantime, let's make a big shift now and go to Washington. The House of Representatives has the votes to restrain the president's actions when it comes to war powers. Joining us now is Congressman Michael McCaul of Texas, the top Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He comes to us from Capitol Hill. Welcome, Mr. Congressman. Thank you very much for joining us. You have some decided views on this subject, and maybe you're not prevailing at the moment. Give us your sense of where it is, where it should go.
Well, it was already rejected in the National Defense Authorization Bill. The Democrats put it back on the floor. I think most of us are in favor of updating and modernizing the 2002 AUMF. However, if you completely repeal it without any replacement in existence, it gives the president no authorities to attack ISIS in Iraq. And I think that would be a very dangerous thing to do. And a lot of this also is preemptively trying to tie the president's hands to respond to, say, any attacks that Iran could have on our military installations in Iraq as well. And I think under Article 2 of the Constitution, there's a self-defense right to respond to these attacks. So I think it's a bit of an overreach. We would like to see an updated AUMF, but to just completely do away with it, I think would be a danger to the homeland.
Congressman, as I understand, there are two proposals right now in the House, two somewhat different proposals. If either one of those or both make it through, is it going to make it to the Senate?
I don't think so, because they were stripped out in the National Defense Authorization Bill back last December. I was on that conference committee, and these two provisions were taken out wholesale. You may see something coming out of the Senate. I know that in the House, we're going to start meeting with my role as the lead Republican on foreign affairs. It's the committee jurisdiction, and we're going to be meeting with members of our conference and then hopefully with the other side of the aisle to maybe work something out where we could modernize it. It's been almost 20 years since this was passed. And I think it could be modernized, but just to take it off the table and take the authorization to go after ISIS in Iraq, I think would be a very dangerous mistake.
Congressman, I wonder from your position on the House Foreign Relations Committee, if there's a message being sent to the White House and how they're receiving the message. Because even if these don't make it into law, you have some bipartisan support for really pulling back on the War Powers Act. It's not just the Democrats. You have a fair number of Republicans, both in the House and the Senate. Is at least that a message sort of saying to the president, you're going too far too fast?
Well, I would argue the president has exercised great restraint. I was in the White House when they shot down our U.S. military asset, the drone. He decided to pull back and not hit back, which was, for him, was sort of surprising. He's shown a lot of restraint. But, David, when they killed an American serviceman, wounded 4 soldiers, attacked our embassy in Baghdad, and had this imminent plot that Soleimani was going to exercise to kill Americans and diplomats, I think the president was totally justified in acting at that point in time. Had he not, and that had gone forward, you can imagine, the criticisms that would come out from that. With respect to my side of the aisle, I think there were only 5 votes in favor of the Democrats' bill today.
So maybe a little bipartisan, but not very much bipartisan, what you're saying. Hey, thank you so much, Congressman.
Yeah.
Always great to have you with us. A little bit, exactly. Congressman Michael McCaul, he's the Republican ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to continue on Bloomberg Radio in our second hour. We're going to talk with UPS CEO David Abney. We'll also have some discussions about what's going on in the Ukraine, the geopolitics there, with Thomas Pickering, former ambassador for the United States. This is Balance of Power. We're on Bloomberg Television, and we are on radio.